So if we were to draw up a list of the most influential authors of the last 2 centuries, Jules Verne would have to be right near the top.
Oh, absolutely.
You can almost picture him there, probably carrying a giant file of meticulously researched notes, maybe standing next to a model of the Nautilus.
That's the image, isn't it?
And we all know the titles: 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, Journeying to the Center of the Earth, Around the World in 80 Days. I mean, he basically defined adventure and the future for generations.
And that reach is, it's statistically undeniable. The sheer global scale of his influence is just staggering.
How staggering are we talking?
Well, since 1979, Jules Verne has been the second most translated author in the entire world.
Second. Who's first?
Agatha Christie. So he's ranking just below her, but pulling ahead of William Shakespeare.
Wow. Ahead of Shakespeare.
And just in the 2010s, he was the most translated French author, period. That's a legacy that's just truly universal.
A universal legacy, but one that's, and this is the fascinating part, built on a surprisingly fragile foundation, and often based on a pretty profound misunderstanding.
Yes.
And that's really the core conflict we're here to unpack. Because despite all that incredible success and influence, you find the man himself, late in life, stating that the great regret of his life was that he'd never taken any place in French literature.
That one statement just fundamentally shifts the lens, doesn't it? It forces you to reevaluate everything. So our mission today is really to move beyond that simplistic label he always gets, the father of science fiction. We need to see Verne as a much more complex literary artist.
And a passionate man, too.
Yeah.
Marked by these really intense personal conflicts early on.
Absolutely. And above all, a writer whose career was indelibly shaped, and you could argue in many ways artistically compromised, by the commercial demands of his very powerful publisher, Pierre-Jules Hetzel.
So for this, we've used an extensive biographical and critical review. It really digs into his maritime origins, the surprising depth of his research process, and, critically, this tale of 2 reputations.
The one he earned in France.
And the damaged, sort of watered-down version that was distributed across the entire English-speaking world.
So how could an author whose work defined exploration and technology be so consistently edited, simplified, and even dismissed in one half of the world?
While at the same time, in his home country, he's being fought over as a literary giant worthy of university study.
That's the question. So we're going to dive deep into those sources and try to find the real man, the complex artist behind the marvelous machine.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we begin?
We have to start, like all good adventure stories should, right at the water's edge. Nantes, Brittany, in 1828. You just can't understand why Verne wrote so much about the sea until you understand where he was born.
It's everything.
He literally came into the world on Ile Feydeau, which at the time was an artificial island sitting right in the middle of the Loire River.
Right, so that geography is absolutely critical. The Loire was this huge artery of commerce flowing directly out into the Atlantic.
So his childhood view wasn't of, Parisian salons or quiet fields.
No, it was masts, rigging, and these huge merchant vessels arriving from all these faraway ports. His family life just reinforced this.
In what way?
Well, his father, Pierre Verne, was a respected avoué, basically a lawyer, but his mother's family, the Allot de la Fouet, they were local navigators and ship owners. They even claimed a distant connection to Scottish descent.
So that family tension was baked in right from the very start.
It really was.
You've got law and respectable society on one side, and then the unpredictable but fascinating life of the sea on the other.
And Verne himself recalled having a deep fascination with the Loire and just the constant traffic of the merchant vessels. It was his whole world.
And this fascination wasn't just some abstract thing, was it? It was personal.
It was very personal. He spent his vacations at a place called Brains, staying with his uncle, Prudent Allot, Uncle Prudent. And Prudent wasn't just some former ship owner. The source confirms he was a retired mariner who had actually sailed around the world.
Imagine that.
Right. Imagine growing up in 19th century France with a great uncle who could tell you stories about the entire globe. It provided not just inspiration, but an early real-life model for global exploration.
So that real-world background gave him the setting. But the theme that really defined his work, this idea of escape and survival, the Robinsonade, that was planted by his teacher.
At 6 years old.
Yeah, at 6 years old. It's a fascinating psychological detail.
It is. In 1834, Jules was sent to a boarding school where the teacher was a woman named Madame Sambin. Her husband was a naval captain who had been missing, presumed lost at sea, for decades.
That's incredibly tragic.
But instead of mourning, she would tell the children that her husband was merely a castaway. that he would one day return ingeniously surviving, just like Daniel Defoe's character, Robinson Crusoe.
Wow. That is such a powerful image to plant in a child's mind.
Isn't it?
It turns loss into promise and absence into a potential adventure. It's like a blueprint for heroism through isolation.
Exactly. And that blueprint stayed with him for his entire life. It became a major theme.
He kept coming back to it.
He repeatedly explored this idea of characters being marooned and then forced to rebuild civilization through sheer scientific ingenuity.
You see it most clearly in The Mysterious Island in 1874, where the protagonist literally transform an island into this technological paradise.
Right, but also in The School for Robinsons in 1882, and even really late in his career with The Castaways of the Flag in 1900, it's this permanent narrative fixation, a kind of psychological safe harbor for him.
Okay, so speaking of formative childhood events, we have to tackle the really famous story that almost every English biography includes, the Coralie legend.
Ah, yes.
Can you tell us the actual story versus the myth that's been built up around it?
Of course. The famous story, the one everyone knows, is that an 11-year-old Jules, desperate to win a coral necklace for his cousin Caroline, snuck aboard the three-mast ship Coralie as a cabin boy.
His plan being to sail to the Indies to earn his fortune.
Right, and his father supposedly caught him at the very last minute and forced him to promise that he would only travel in his imagination from then on.
I have to admit, I always love that anecdote. It just perfectly sets up the armchair adventurer narrative, but the source confirms it's largely fictionalized, isn't it?
It's highly exaggerated. It was popularized by his first biographer, who was actually his niece, Marguerite Alain, and she likely did it to create a more dramatic, more marketable origin story.
So there was no grand escape.
Well, there might have been a minor, real incident where he tried to run away, but the sweeping, cinematic escape on the Coralie to retrieve a necklace, that's basically a piece of historical fiction.
Wait, so the legendary promise, travel only in his imagination, was essentially manufactured by his own niece?
It seems so.
That's an incredible betrayal of the historical record, but at the same time, it's the perfect, almost prophetic summary of his later life.
It is, and it serves as a really powerful illustration of how easily myth can replace reality, especially when it provides such a clean narrative arc.
So the truth is that his imagination was spurred by something much more mundane.
By rejection and duty, not a foiled sea voyage.
And duty meant law. His father, Pierre Verne, fully expected Jules, as the firstborn son, to inherit the established, respectable family law practice in Nantes.
So in 1847, Jules was sent off to Paris for law school. He was technically fulfilling his filial duty, but his passion was completely elsewhere.
He just threw himself into the Parisian literary world.
He did. He was heavily influenced by Victor Hugo's Romantic movement and started writing serious theater. This is where he befriends Alexandre Dumas, Phil's the son of the famous novelist.
So he's trying to be a serious man of letters. He's sharing a flat with the composer Aristide Hignard, just soaking up that whole artistic scene.
He did manage to pass his law exams, earning his license en droit in January 1851. But by then, his heart belonged entirely to the stage and the page.
And this conflict with his father came to an inevitable climax in January 1852.
His father issued the ultimate ultimatum. Return to Nantes immediately and take over the established practice or be cut off financially.
That's the moment of decision that determined his entire career.
And he refused. The source gives us his definitive, really courageous reply. He wrote, "Am I not right to follow my own instincts? It's because I know who I am that I realize what I can be one day."
It was a complete rejection of his father's expectations and that whole secure bourgeois life that was waiting for him in Nantes.
So his professional life was determined by this profound break with his father's world, but his romantic life was similarly defined by an earlier, and you could argue equally painful, rejection.
This is the Hermione complex.
Exactly. A wound that really marked his literary output forever.
So tell us about the Hermione complex. It sounds like something that reaches far deeper than just a simple heartbreak.
It does. While he was studying in Paris, Verne met a woman named Rose Herminie Arnaud Grostier back in Nantes in 1848, and he fell just intensely and completely in love with her.
He was writing her poetry.
Dozens of romantic poems. For him, this was the central defining romance of his young life.
But her parents objected, I assume, just as his father would have objected to his literary ambitions.
Precisely. Herminie's parents rejected Verne as a potential husband because he was just a law student with this uncertain, maybe even scandalous ambition of becoming a writer.
Not a good prospect.
Not at all. So they quickly married her off instead to a man named Armand de la Haye, who was a very rich landowner.
So the woman he loved was taken from him not because she didn't love him back, but because of his uncertain financial and social status. That must have been a permanent wound. It would have just confirmed his suspicion that nonce society prioritized wealth over passion or artistic merit.
It absolutely was. The scholar Christian Schelleberg actually coined the term Hermione complex to describe the direct psychological fallout, which you can see across Verne's entire bibliography.
So this complex refers to a recurring literary trope in his work.
Yes, the trope of the young, innocent woman married against her will, often to an older, richer, or socially superior man, which then results in tragedy, emotional isolation, or just desperation.
Can you give us some examples of how this psychological wound showed up in his novels?
Sure. Look at Gironde in his early novella, Master Zacharias, from 1854. She's engaged to a wealthy but heartless suitor and faces tragedy. Or you could consider Sava in Matthias Sandor from 1885.
What happens to her?
Her father's enemy arranges her marriage purely for financial gain. And then famously, there's Ellen in A Floating City from 1871, who is trapped in a terrible marriage and is desperately seeking escape.
So these characters, trapped by financial and societal constraints, are just direct projections of his painful experience.
And his grudge against the rigid social structure that denied him his love.
It's a really powerful realization. The adventure writer, the supposed prophet of technology, was actually driven not by the purity of science, but by this profound emotional pain and the deep desire to see justice done for the wronged and the displaced.
Absolutely. And you have to remember, the early life challenges weren't just romantic and professional. They were also physical.
That's right. The sources detail his health issues.
He suffered from these recurring, intense stomach cramps, what modern medical scholars now hypothesize was probably colitis. And he also endured 4 distinct attacks of facial paralysis.
Which must have been terrifying.
He feared it was a nervous disorder that was leading to madness, though it was likely caused by a middle ear inflammation. But living with those chronic, unexplained physical ailments must have added another layer of anxiety to his already precarious existence as a struggling writer.
It certainly seemed to contribute to a sense of internal conflict. His physical struggles also paralleled his political ones.
Yes, when he was required to enlist in the military in 1851, he expressed these strong, articulate anti-war sentiments. He wrote that to perform military duties, you have to abandon all dignity.
And that principled anti-militarism remained a constant theme in his work, didn't it?
It did, sometimes even leading to conflict with his more conservative father.
So he has rejected the law, he suffered this profound romantic wound, and he's trying to survive as a writer in Paris with no family support. How does he bridge that gap between his literary aspirations and the simple need for a stable income?
He finds a solution through marriage and finance. He marries Honorine and Hebe Morel in 1857, who was a widow and already had 2 children, which offered him some stability.
And then critically, he gets a job.
He does. To secure the kind of steady income that would allow him to write freely, he finally leaves the unstable world of theater and takes a full-time job as an agent de change, which is essentially a stockbroker on the Paris Bourse.
A stockbroker. That seems like the ultimate anti-Verne job.
It does, doesn't it?
The world of numbers, risk, and bourgeois finance, clashing with these dreams of global escape.
But that tension is key. The Bourse job was a compromise, a necessary sacrifice. But this is where the meticulous researcher we all know truly took shape.
Because he had to be so disciplined.
Incredibly. He had to wake up extremely early each morning to write before the Bourse opened. But during his off hours, he wasn't socializing. He was just relentlessly accumulating knowledge.
Let's talk about his research system, because this is what separates him from most other writers of his time.
He effectively created his own private library and database. He spent vast amounts of time at the Bibliothèque nationale de France, taking copious, organized notes from every book, newspaper, magazine, or scientific report he could get his hands on.
It maintained this gigantic personal system of note cards.
Cross-referenced by geography, geology, astronomy, technology. He kept his system for the rest of his life. He was a professional writer working in secret, building the factual reservoir that would eventually fuel his voyages extraordinaires.
He wasn't inventing, he was curating.
Precise.
And this diligence and just the sheer volume of his notes brings us directly to the single most important, and I think you could say fraught, collaboration of his entire career.
His publisher.
The relationship that would make him world famous, but also change his artistic identity, his partnership with Pierre-Jules Hetzel.
That meeting in 1862 was a true pivot point in literary history. Verne came to Hetzel, who was already one of France's most influential publishers.
He'd worked with literary heavyweights like Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, Georges Sand.
Exactly. And Verne presented him with a manuscript that was then titled Voyages en ballon.
And Hetzel wasn't just looking for adventure fiction. He had a very specific, ambitious commercial and moral purpose in mind.
Absolutely. Hetzel was just about to launch his high-quality family magazine, the Magazine d'Éducation et de Récréation, the magazine of education and recreation.
And this was aimed at a very specific audience.
High-minded, progressive bourgeois families. It needed content that was rigorously entertaining and instructive. It was designed to educate French youth in geography and modern science, while upholding very strict moral standards.
And Verne's manuscript, which later became 5 Weeks in a Balloon, fit that mandate perfectly. It was scientifically researched, exciting, and morally clean.
Hetzel accepted the novel, but only after requiring revisions to make it less dryly scientific. He wanted more action. It was published in 1863, and it launched Verne's career.
But the real game changer was the long-term contract Verne signed.
Yes.
Tell us about the specifics of that contract, because it gave him financial security, but at what cost to his artistic freedom?
Well, Verne agreed to provide 3 volumes of text per year for a flat annual fee. Crucially, this was a steady salary, not a royalty per book sale.
So he could finally leave the stock market.
He could leave the insecurity of the bourse and live solely on his writing. It guaranteed him an audience and financial freedom, but it also placed him firmly under Hetzel's editorial control for decades.
And this collaboration quickly turned into a literary mandate, officially launching the series Voyages Extraordinaires, the extraordinary voyages, with the publication of The Adventures of Captain Hatteras in 1866.
And Hetzel's vision for this series was, frankly, encyclopedic. He explicitly stated this ambitious goal. The series was to outline all the geographical, geological, physical, and astronomical knowledge amassed by modern science.
And to recount, in an entertaining and picturesque format that is his own, the history of the universe.
I mean, that is almost arrogant in its scope, the history of the universe.
And Verne later confirmed that this ambition to depict the entire Earth, and not just the Earth but the universe, was his running theme. He recognized the ambition, though, noting that to leave a completed work behind, one would need to live to be at least 100 years old.
But here is the critical point. That mandate demanded optimism, educational rigor, and commercial viability. And that commercial structure led directly to major artistic conflicts, because Verne's natural inclinations were often darker, more pessimistic, and politically sharper than Hetzel's family audience could bear.
Let's focus on those 3 critical moments of conflict, because they tell us everything about the tension between the artist and the publisher. First, the editorial interference on Captain Hatteras.
Right. In the original manuscript, Verne wrote a truly tragic, heroic ending for Captain Hatteras. He sacrifices himself in the Arctic wilderness.
And Hetzel wouldn't have it.
He absolutely refused. He demanded that Verne rewrite the climax, insisting that the protagonist must survive.
So Verne had to change the entire artistic trajectory of the novel just to satisfy the commercial need for a less depressing ending.
Yes, Hatteras survived, but he went mad. He was left babbling incoherently and always pointing north, forever searching for the pole he found. It was a compromise that allowed for survival while retaining a sliver of that tragic weight, but it was still a major concession to the mandated optimism of the Voyages extraordinaires.
Okay, the second conflict is even more famous because it involves a book that was almost entirely suppressed, Paris, in the 20th century.
Verne wrote this manuscript in 1863, very early in his career, and it was a complete departure from the educational adventure model he was developing.
It was a dystopian future, a satire set in the year 1960.
And in it, he envisioned a world dominated by giant glass skyscrapers, vast impersonal financial institutions, and a complete absence of meaningful art or culture.
It was a full-throated condemnation of the machine age and a highly pessimistic view of technological progress, a view that was completely contradictory to the image Hetzel was trying to cultivate for him.
So Hetzel rejected the manuscript outright. He found it too subversive and far too negative for a family magazine focused on education and recreation.
He even reportedly advised Verne.
Stick to your wonderful geographical stories. You are not ready for this subject.
And that manuscript was literally lost to history until it was published posthumously in 1994, and it changed scholarly perception overnight.
It proved that Verne was grappling with genuinely dark, complex, and literary ideas about modernity, but he was forced to shelve them to keep his publishing contract.
It's a staggering price to pay for security.
It is. But the third, and perhaps most emotionally taxing conflict, was the battle over Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas in 1869.
Nemo is one of literature's most iconic anti-heroes, a man driven by intellectual brilliance and just this profound vengeance.
But Verne's original conception was deeply political and very specific. Nemo was a Polish scientist whose family was brutally murdered by Russian forces during the suppression of the 1863-1864 January uprising in Poland.
So his vengeance was directed specifically against the Russian Empire.
A deeply political, anti-colonial figure, a rebel against European power structures. But as you can guess, Russia was a crucial, lucrative market for Hetzel's books.
Right, he couldn't afford to alienate them.
Exactly. Hetzel feared alienating the powerful Russian market. The publisher insisted that Nemo's enemy be generalized or redirected. And Verne fought this vehemently, seeing it as an artistic and moral betrayal of his character's motivation.
So what was the compromise they finally reached?
Verne finally compromised by making Nemo's past mysterious. He redirected his vengeance to be vaguely against the oppressors of the world, and specifically introduced a subplot that tied Nemo to the fight against the slave trade.
So while the final work is still incredibly powerful, that profound, personal, anti-colonial rage that originally fueled Nemo was diluted.
It was. And this entire pattern, the survival of Hatteras, the suppression of Paris in the 20th century, the neutering of Nemo's politics, it demonstrates how the security of the Hetzel contract came at the cost of Verne's freedom to be a darker, more critical, and fundamentally more literary artist.
And yet, despite those creative compromises, the collaboration led to massive financial success. It enabled Verne to achieve the kind of bourgeois respectability he had once been denied.
The real wealth, though, didn't just come from book sales, which were substantial. It came largely from the enormously successful stage adaptations of his works.
Around the World in 80 Days in 1874 and Michael Strogoff in 1876 were just smash hits on the Parisian stage. They became cultural phenomena that cemented his fame and earned him a substantial income from theatrical rights.
And that financial freedom allowed him to indulge his lifelong love of the sea, transforming his life from an armchair researcher into a genuine, though I'd say cautious, traveler.
He purchased 3 successive boats, all named Saint-Michel.
And actually sailed them around Europe.
It's important to note, though, that these voyages were not just vacations. They were extended research trips.
Oh, absolutely. He meticulously documented the coastlines, the weather, the ports he visited, and was continually feeding his note card system with fresh, first-hand data. He used these trips to gather the precise details that gave his novels their authenticity.
Personal tragedy did strike, however, in 1886.
A very difficult year for him. On March 9th, Verne was shot twice in the leg by his nephew Gaston, who was suffering from mental illness and spent the rest of his life in an asylum.
And the bullet caused a permanent limp, a physical reminder of the dark side of his family life.
And in that same year, 1886, Hetzel died. It's a remarkable confluence of events.
It is.
And after the death of his demanding, commercially focused publisher, and after his own personal trauma, scholars note that Verne's works became noticeably darker and more cynical.
He shifted his focus somewhat, moving more fully into public life. He was elected town councilor of Amiens in 1888.
And he served there for 15 years, championing public libraries and civic improvements.
He died on March 24th, 1905, in Amiens, suffering from chronic diabetes and complications from a stroke. His son, Michel Verne, then took over the management of his literary estate, overseeing the publication of the final manuscripts.
And here is the kicker that adds yet another layer of editorial complexity and revisionism to his story.
Go on.
It was later discovered that Michel Verne had made extensive changes, often rewriting his father's final, darker works, including The Lighthouse at the End of the World and The Golden Volcano, before they were published in the Voyages extraordinaires series.
So even after his death, the real Verne was being masked by editorial interference, trying to maintain that established tone of optimism and adventure that Hetzel had defined.
Exactly. The original unedited versions of these later works only finally saw publication toward the end of the 20th century, revealing the extent of the tragedy.
So the man we thought we knew was a diligent researcher constantly battling commercial mandates, a political voice silenced by market fears, and an author edited by both his publisher and his own son.
And that context fundamentally changes how we view the next crucial section. The powerful myth that he was primarily a technological prophet.
It is the single most common label attached to him, the father of science fiction. Yet your source material shows that Verne himself vehemently rejected this title and the whole notion that he was predicting the future.
He flatly stated, "I have invented nothing." He saw himself not as a technician or a futurist, but as a literary artist.
So his actual goal was not to forecast technology.
No, it was to depict the Earth and, vitally, to achieve a very high ideal of beauty of style. He wanted to be judged alongside Balzac and Hugo, not simply as a novelty writer of gadgets.
This is a crucial distinction that most English-speaking readers entirely miss. If he wasn't trying to invent, then what was the role of science and technology in his books?
For Verne, science was simply a vehicle. It was a narrative necessity, not the destination or the core intellectual focus of the story. He explained this himself, using the perfect example of his first novel, 5 Weeks in a Balloon.
Right. He clarified that he wrote the book not as a story about ballooning, but as a story about Africa.
Precisely. His goal was to provide a romantic, factual, and geographical description of the African continent at a time when much of it was still being charted. But, as he said, there was no means of taking my travelers through Africa otherwise than in a balloon, and that is why a balloon is introduced.
He even admitted he had no faith in the possibility of ever steering balloons at the time he wrote the novel.
He did.
That shifts the paradigm entirely. The submarine, the moon cannon, the drilling apparatus, they are narrative solutions. They're structural devices that allow his characters to reach the remote, researched corners of the world he wanted to describe.
The science merely serves the geography and the psychological adventure.
And yet the myth persists that he was this genius prophet who foresaw everything from the lunar module to the electric submarine.
And the scholarly consensus suggests this enduring claim is heavily exaggerated, driven by something less tangible than actual truth.
What's the evidence for that exaggeration? I found Theodore L. Thomas's observation from 1961 really fascinating here.
Thomas observed that Verne's profound storytelling skill, coupled with readers' faulty memories of books they often first encountered as children, causes people to remember things from it that are not there.
So we fill in the blanks.
We do. The impression of valid scientific prediction, Thomas notes, seems to grow as the years roll by.
That is a startling thought. The prophecy isn't inherent in the text. It's manufactured by our own nostalgia and post hoc rationalization. We see the invention today, and we just assume Verne must have written it exactly as it is now.
A perfect example is From the Earth to the Moon. Readers remember the precise calculations in the Florida launch site. But what they forget is that Verne's capsule was soft-cushioned and launched from a giant cannon, an idea that, scientifically, would have instantly killed the occupants due to the G-forces.
So it's the accurate geographical research that sticks in our minds, while the impossible mechanics are forgotten. So if the accuracy wasn't prophecy, how do we explain his indisputable command of detail regarding, say, the pressure resistance of a submarine hull, or the dimensions required for a long-distance cannon?
Verne himself always attributed any connection between scientific developments and his work to mere coincidence. He didn't have a crystal ball. He had that meticulously organized filing cabinet filled with notes.
It all comes back to the research.
It does. His accuracy was the direct result of his relentless, almost manic research. He said he always took numerous notes out of every book, newspaper, magazine, or scientific report that I came across. He was extrapolating based on the best current data available, not inventing new laws of physics.
That makes him less of a futuristic prophet and more of a masterful cartographer of existing knowledge.
Yeah.
It's the difference between extrapolation based on cutting-edge data and genuine speculative invention.
It's the difference between Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who really did delve into the sociological implications of impossible technology.
And this complexity led to huge ambiguity in how critics categorized him.
The French writer Maurice Renard claimed Verne never wrote a single sentence of scientific marvelous, which highlights the difficult relationship between the Voyages, extraordinaires and what later became defined as Anglo-American science fiction. For French critics, his work was too grounded in reality to be simple genre fiction.
And that struggle over genre and intent leads directly to the tragedy of his literary reputation. This is maybe the most acute point of this deep dive. the tale of two completely different literary reputations on either side of the channel.
In France, the trajectory was initially one of great promise and admiration. Early in his career, he was enthusiastically received and celebrated by major literary figures.
People like George Sand.
George Sand, one of the most prominent writers of the time, wrote effusively about his work, and Théophile Gautier praised his style.
So why did he end up feeling like an outsider who never took any place in French literature?
Because of his massive, overwhelming popular success, especially with the stage adaptations. When Around the World in 80 Days became a global theatrical phenomenon, Verne was suddenly viewed by the literary elite as too commercial, too popular.
And too focused on entertainment rather than high art.
It's the classic snobbery trap. Once you become a mass success, you are dismissed as a commodity.
And contemporary critics, like Émile Zola, started to dismiss him as merely a genre-based storyteller, unfit for serious academic study or nomination for the prestigious Académie Française.
They saw the technological apparatus as childish, completely missing the rich geographic and stylistic detail that was really at the core of his work.
And this critical dismissal, based purely on literary ideology and his market penetration, was felt so acutely by Verne himself.
And that is the source of his profound lament about never taking any place in French literature. He craved the recognition of his peers as a stylist.
For decades after his death, this academic snub persisted. But in the 1960s and 70s, something shifted.
A massive French rehabilitation began. A Jules Verne cult developed among scholars and young writers who started taking his work seriously as literature, not just as adventure stories.
And it was literary heavyweights who forced the change. Roland Barthes, the great French literary theorist, wrote the seminal essay Nautilus des Bateaux Ivres.
Nautilus and the Drunken Boat.
Right.
And Barthes' essay was pivotal because it treated the Voyages' extraordinaires as a purely literary text. Barthes analyzed Verne's use of language, his symbolism, his narrative structures.
Treating the mechanisms like the Nautilus, not as technical blueprints, but as profound psychological metaphors.
Yes, metaphors for enclosure, solitude, and exploration. This forced the critics to analyze his style and themes, rather than just his technological gadgetry.
And the final validation, the ultimate sign that he was now officially recognized as high art, came in 1978.
That's when Journey to the Center of the Earth was accepted for the French university system's aggregation reading list.
Now, for listeners unfamiliar, the aggregation is a highly competitive national examination required to certify secondary school teachers.
And its reading list is reserved for works considered essential to French literary and cultural heritage. Verne's inclusion meant he was now mandatory study, confirming his status as an unquestioned member of the French literary canon.
Okay, now contrast that powerful trajectory with his reputation in the English-speaking world, which, as the source notes, was considerably slower in changing.
Often dismissing him as a writer for children or a naive proponent of science.
And the tragedy here is entirely commercial and translational?
It is. British and American publishers in the 19th and early 20th centuries made a conscious decision to market his books almost exclusively to young audiences. This commercial choice cemented his long-term reputation as merely a children's author, preventing adult readers and serious critics from engaging with his work.
But the real sin was the quality deficit. The early English translations are universally criticized for being not just poor, but fundamentally altered, abridged, and just full of errors.
So readers in the Anglophone world weren't actually reading Verne. They were reading highly commercialized, simplified adaptations.
And the quotes from contemporary writers who later discovered the original French are they're damning.
The British writer Adam Roberts noted the bizarre situation that he realized he hadn't been reading Jules Verne at all for decades, but rather these simplified English versions.
And Michael Crichton, the American novelist, was particularly scathing. He described the published English prose as clunky, choppy, tone-deaf.
Crichton specifically investigated the notorious 1872 translation of Journey to the Center of the Earth by a publisher called Griffith and Farren.
And what he found was just shocking.
Crichton noted that the translators blithely altered the text, giving Verne's characters new names and adding whole pages of their own invention, thus effectively obliterating the meaning and tone of Verne's original.
They didn't just shorten books. They actively injected new, incorrect scientific data, and critically, they removed the detailed geographical and technical descriptions that Verne had so meticulously researched.
Think about that magnitude of editorial vandalism.
That's incredible.
Whole pages of invented material, crucial passages of scientific exposition removed, character names changed, And his political critiques, like those we discussed with Nemo, often sanitized completely.
This just provided English-speaking readers with a cheap, simplistic version, missing the very literary and scientific depth that earned him his admiration in France.
And the most unfortunate reality is that while far more accurate English translations have appeared since 1965, those older, deficient public domain versions are continually republished and distributed freely, especially online.
So it just prolongs the misunderstanding for millions of new readers, creating a permanent barrier to the real Verne.
Despite the persistent critical misrepresentation, especially in the English world, his influence has been massive and widespread.
On the literary side, he influenced heavy hitters like Roland Barthes, Jean-Paul Sartre, Julio Cortázar.
And the author of The Little Prince, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry.
And the scientific community has been equally inspired. Explorers and scientists who acknowledge Verne's profound inspiration include the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin.
The rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, the Soviet rocketry pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and the controversial American rocket engineer Jack Parsons.
He also essentially helped inspire the entire steampunk genre, which glamorizes science fiction based on 19th century technology.
The ultimate summary of his legacy, simplified or not, really comes from Ray Bradbury, who said, "We are all, in one way or another, the children of Jules Verne."
We've spent this deep dive uncovering the profound layers of Jules Verne, moving far past that simple label of a prophet of technology.
We've seen him as the deeply emotional man marked by lost love, the victim of the Hermione complex. We've seen him as the diligent researcher, meticulously filling his note cards with facts that gave his fiction an unparalleled realism.
He was the anti-war voice and the literary artist who valued style, constantly battling a powerful publisher, Hetzel, whose commercial mandate demanded that Verne's complex, sometimes pessimistic, work be simplified, sanitized, and made palatable for a family audience.
And we have seen how those commercial interests led to the profound, tragic betrayal of his work in English translation.
And the relevance for you, the listener, is clear. Verne's visionary work didn't spring from some mystical ability to see the future.
No, it came from an informed, meticulous exploration of existing scientific knowledge, combined with a profound psychological understanding of what motivates humanity escape, vengeance, and the desire for justice. True visionary work often stems from relentless, informed research, not just prophecy.
We discussed how Verne lamented that to finish his project he would have needed to live to be 100 years old. And we also discussed how his son Michel altered some of his final, darker manuscripts.
And we know that the original, highly pessimistic manuscript of Paris in the 20th century, written in 1863, was suppressed for decades and only found and published in 1994.
So this raises one final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Considering the decades of rigid editorial control he faced, both from Hetzel and his own son, and the dark nature of the original works that have been recovered, what other lost, darker, or more literary manuscripts of the real Jules Verne might still be hidden in some dusty archive, waiting to fundamentally change our understanding of this world-spanning imagination?